apologies to those who couldn't hear. I hope that's sorted out for you now. And Christy brought it to my attention there while Carmel was speaking. In terms of the place where we now sit and its future, and always after Carmel's remarks I add to this, there are those who would like to build here. There are those who would like to put apartments here and whatever you have. As long as I have a voice to prevent it, not a shovel will be swung until we know what's down there. Now that's the only small role I can play. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest speaker this afternoon comes to us from the School of Law and Government at Dublin City University, where he's an associate professor, and he's researched human rights, international law, and legal and transitional justice for much of his career. He has just published Transitional Justice and the Historical Abuses of Church and State, most appropriate, I think, for where we are this afternoon. Would you welcome, please, Dr. James Gallen.
And I'd like to acknowledge victim survivors, their families, advocates, allies, and everyone who's gathered here today. I really appreciate your presence and the chance we have to share this time together. I was asked today to speak a little bit about the phrase transitional justice and perhaps how Ireland has attempted to deal with its past. You know better than me some of the limitations and failures and excuses that have been given by successive governments and successive ministers. So I don't intend to speak for you, but perhaps to put some of what has happened in context, to talk about power and how it remains out of your hands, and hopefully to end with some note of hope. The poet Wendell Berry says, "There are no sacred and unsacred places. There are only sacred and desecrated places." And what was done to women and to children on this site desecrated the land, desecrated bodies, and desecrated entire lives. And in attempting to deal with the past in the last 30 years or so, Ireland joins its peers, such as Canada, Australia, and our neighbours, and Scotland and England, in dealing with non-recent harms. Some have a problem with the idea of these being historical abuses because history hasn't passed or is still present for many of us and for many of you. And so Canada and Australia have dealt with the theft of children, the stolen generation in the Indian residential schools. And so in looking at their experience alongside our own, we can compare and contrast what has worked here and what has worked in other jurisdictions. And spoiler alert, Ireland is coming paddy last of the table of practices and survivor needs. So transitional justice is designed to be a mechanism by which a state reckons with the past legacy of large-scale violence, the type of violence of family separation, of neglect, of forced adoption. And it's designed to address 4 different components: an investigation, accountability, redress, and reform. Some of this will obviously sound familiar. But the key thing, I guess, is that the process by which we deal with the past matters as much as the outcome. And the process in Ireland has been dreadful. I believe survivors have been neglected, survivors have been ignored. When they have engaged with state-led processes, they have been disbelieved, they have been edited, and so on and so on. And I'm sure many of you know better than me. So what should we be doing? Well, a transitional justice approach is supposed to start from the premise that survivors have rights. They had rights all throughout the 20th century. The Constitution existed and said they have bodily integrity, they have dignity, they have liberty, and that all of these rights were ignored and were marginalised. And still today, even when we have apologies from our Taoiseach, there is no recognition that the Constitution was violated, that their rights had been harmed. The Constitution and our rights would also suggest the state has to undertake certain obligations when allegations are made. If we don't know the whereabouts of so many children, they have to conduct prompt, thorough, and independent investigations, and their failure to do so is an ongoing violation of your rights and the rights of those others who are affected. The second thing transitional justice is supposed to do, and I'm sure you've heard this one, is it's supposed to be centered on victim survivors. Very easy to say, often comes out of the mouth of government ministers or civil servants, but very, very challenging, or apt in its absence. We know it when it's not there. Imagine this, a process that was defined by victims and survivors, where their voice is listened to, where it is respected throughout the process at all levels of planning and implementation, and where the success or failure of the process is defined by its ability to meet your needs. I've seen no side of that in Ireland. And the final piece of transitional justice is supposed to be holistic. What happened in industrial schools and Magdalen laundries and mother and baby homes and non-institutional adoptions is part of a large system of abuse. And rather than separate out small pieces, it was incumbent on our government to address the whole of the system. If it's going to address Tuam, it has to address here. If it's going to address here, it has to address Seanross, and so on, and so on. So the Irish government, unsurprisingly, hasn't framed its dealing with the past as a transitional justice exercise, except for the period where Catherine Zappone was in government. And even then, and mea culpa, her work with the Collaborative Forum was greatly stymied as the government failed to publish the survivor-led report there. So instead, I've used transitional justice to evaluate what the country's been doing. And I said the approach the Irish government has taken claims the legitimacy from survivors, that it says we're meeting survivors' needs, but there's no meaningful change or transition in how they are treated by state or by church, and unfortunately, in some cases, by society. And we know this is true, because we saw the Commission report. It excluded survivor voices except from the confidential committee, and was successfully challenged in the High Court by Philomena Lee and Mary Harney, where the government now has to publish a statement with the Commission report saying survivors do not accept that it is, quote, a true and full reflection of its evidence. That's the official online version and the official Oireachtas version. But we know that Commission, we know the Redress scheme, we know the burial scheme, all retains power. Not in your hands, but in the hands of government actors, and indeed in the hands of institutions as well. It doesn't have to be this way. Other inquiries, other reports in other jurisdictions put survivors front and centre in a meaningful way. Survivors are among the commissioners. Survivor gets to choose who does the questioning or who does the investigation. I think the country is there and has an appetite to support survivors and their families and advocates in amplifying and centering their voices, and we need to continue to focus on that. We know the government is currently finishing up its redress scheme, going through the Oireachtas. We know it listened to survivors, or thought it was listening to survivors. It commissioned consultations with the Oak Group that some of you may have spoken to, and then ignored those recommendations, focusing instead on its own interdepartmental working group, which is why Redress excludes people who are in institutions for less than 6 months. One of the arguments in the Dáil is that to give all survivors a remedy would be too expensive. It would cost 1.6 billion and include a further 24,000 survivors. And to that I say, so what? This is a large-scale, widespread, systemic abuse of citizens of this country. It should be costly. If you can find money for mica and broken homes, as difficult as that is, you can find it for these institutions. And I hope Mr. O'Gorman will get fruitful negotiations with the religious orders involved, that they may make a meaningful contribution. To put it in context, when we provided redress to survivors of residential institutions through the Redress Board, that was €1.4 billion. Giving about 15,000 survivors of physical and sexual abuse compensation. In Canada, they paid $5 billion to 80,000 survivors of residential schools and $3 billion to survivors of the 60s scoop illegal adoption process. So the figures are big, but we're not out of kilter. This is a large-scale problem. It's going to cost us, because to address the past involves some degree of cost. Mairead Enright and I suggested that instead of the redress scheme that has been proposed, there should be at least 2 common payments to all survivors. The first should be a common experience payment from anyone in any institution related to maternity care between 1922 and 1998, and a second common payment for the experience of family separation, whether in an institution or not. And we made these submissions to the Oireachtas Committee at the time. A comprehensive payment is necessary to recognise the severity of the harm that was experienced here and in other similar institutions. And again, the process by which redress is delivered is as crucial as its outcome. I'm conscious of where we are. I'm conscious of what we know and what we don't know about remains. In academia, we speak about ambiguous loss. Knowing and not knowing, hoping and not hoping about the fate of a loved one. And in law, in the European Court of Human Rights, that itself is a violation of someone's rights, to put them through that anxiety and put them through that suffering, to know and to not know. And so I'm conscious and slightly hopeful of the appointment of Daniel McSweeney from the International Committee of the Red Cross to the site at Tuam, or the Institutional Burials Act. But I'm also conscious how piecemeal and how difficult and how challenging it is to encourage government to reflect upon the fact that it needs to be holistic and look at sites like Bessborough and elsewhere through the same lens and with the same resources. Again, Ireland is not alone. Last week, Spain began a process of exhuming Civil War dead from those killed between 1936 and 1939. In Canada, again, from institutions like this one, between 3,000 and 6,000 students died, and 1,900 of those students remain unaccounted for. So children, again, are being looked for across the continent of North America, and again in unmarked graves, and are using some of the same technologies and processes that are talked about here. We are not alone in this. We are doing it badly. So let's try and veer towards hope. In the book that was mentioned in my introduction, which is available for free online, and I'm very happy to give anybody a copy if they're interested, I describe what the state has done in Ireland as unrepentant justice. It claims to be justice, it claims to be meeting survivor needs, but it refuses to accept survivors' claims to the past, their claims to truth, their claims that their rights have been violated. And the state, and indeed the religious orders and churches, refuse to accept not just that bad things happened in isolation, but that entire systems of running the country were wrong and continue to be wrong today. And so this unrepentant justice needs a much more fundamental change. And again, I believe the country is there for it. I believe the country is ready for that change, and it is the state and religious actors who are behind. The harms we're experiencing, the harms you have lived through and your families have experienced, were widespread and were profound. They won't be adequately addressed through a piecemeal approach, or one that leaves our legal or political system intact. A more fundamental reform or reimagination is needed. A first step in this would be to put information in your hands. Why have we not nationalised the archives of every actor involved? State, religious, private. Why are they not digitised, accessible, provided to you in a straightforward and easy manner if you so wanted? Every time we've had a breakthrough in the country, it's because somebody got information that perhaps they shouldn't have. States of fear and suffer little children arose as a result of Owen O'Sullivan getting access to Department of Health and Department of Education files when nobody else did. The only history we have of the Magdalen Laundries by Jacinta Prunty is only possible because of her privileged access to that order's private archives. We need to exhaust the idea of what's written on paper. And if we still don't know what we need to know after that, then we can go further. So to conclude, just a few brief thoughts. We're all burdened by what happened to survivors as a country. It shapes our identity, it shapes our shame, it shapes who we are as Irish people. But we are burdened by it unequally. The walking, talking definition of privilege, like myself, has a responsibility to people here present and a responsibility to those who are no longer with us to address how I have benefited from the injustices that you have suffered. I am an exemplar of every straight white middle-class man, and I too have to put my shoulder to the wheel and do something about what has happened in our country. And I encourage my students and I encourage society to continue to participate in doing so. What we've done in Ireland with our commission, with our redress, with our lack of burial investigation, speaks to an insecure state and an insecure state of religious institutions that, in my view, can't handle the truth of your witness. They can't handle that you continue to exist, that you continue to speak, that you continue to counter the narrative that we are what does Kenny say, a good, God-fearing people. Your witness, your existence, your advocacy, your voice suggests an ongoing contestation, a struggle for power in state and religious institutions that remain unable and unwilling to give away that power to you and to change society more broadly. Survivors, victims, mothers, adoptees, families, advocates have all been extremely, extremely patient. They have waited at least a generation, if not more, for something meaningful to be done by the state. They have been promised much in the past, and in my view, very sadly, it has very often failed to deliver. It is time for different action and more specific action to be taken to ensure your rights and choices are respected and supported, and the decisions are not taken on your behalf, but with you and alongside you, and that you are respected above all. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.